Hi everyone, welcome to this interview by Core Recruitment. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're very lucky to be joined today by Ben Lovett, who's going to be giving us a little bit of insight into his career to date and some of his achievements within hospitality. Ben, how are you today?
Very well, thanks, Krishnan.
Excellent.
Happy to be.
Great,
Yeah,
thank you very much. Where are you calling in from?
I'm in New York. I can't tell by your floating head whether you're actually in that environment. Are those real apples on the
Those
wall?
are real apples. This is the branding. We have an apple climbing wall behind us in the office, which is yeah, it's quite interesting. So thanks. Is that a real
Fake apples based on the squishiness of them. I think
fake apples? Absolutely. Is that a real fire extinguisher behind you, or is that a fake wall? No.
well, let me just. Oh no, that's
All right, no, it's not. All right, fine, good. Okay, fine, good to know. Good to know. So we maybe kick off by telling us a little bit about the business and how you founded the venue group. That'd be fantastic.
yeah. So I've dedicated my life to music from a young age, in all facets of what that's meant. Behind the scenes, on stage, and when I was 18, which is 20 years ago now, I started a company called Communion, which is a concert promoter and record label in London. And we were trying to essentially shed a light on all the talent that was out there that wasn't getting picked up by the mainstream. And we saw there was a lot of opportunities out there for kind of bringing artists that were maybe not immediately apparently kind of fitting into some sort of a box, or maybe they weren't young enough or skinny enough or sexy enough or whatever the thing was. We were just like, but it's good music, and we really believe still Communion continues to thrive today. But when I was 18, I was kind of there being fascinated by the underdog and the kind of the fringe story, and wanting to go out and find artists that maybe were just being overlooked. So we launched that. We did a monthly showcase event at a place called Notting Hill Arts Club, and had a lot of success with it. It was really brilliant. That then grew into a national syndicated showcase of all these different artists, like, up and coming and rising through. And then in 2010, so 14, 15 years ago, I traveled over to New York with the plan to go and roll out that platform. At this point, Muffin & Sons was born. I think we officially started the band when I was maybe 19, 20 years old. So I was like kind of trying to make it as a musician at that age, whilst also Communion was sort of, I guess, technically paying my bills, although I was trying to keep my bills light. And I had this real vision for trying to like do the same kind of work. We were starting to tour as artists in the States, and I was like, I want to do the same sort of work in America. So launched the same nights in places like New York and Nashville and Kansas City and San Francisco, and it was a kind of a national effort. And we had the record label, so some of the artists who were playing at those events were breaking through, and it was really working. So artists like Ben Howard and Michael Kiwanuka and Gautier and some of these acts, like we subsequently signed them to the record label, and then we would roll out their releases, whether it's
Wow.
or globally. So I was like fully in that headspace. I was like running at that point the US operations and of Communion, and then I saw it as my day job. I still consider myself having two lives. I have like my day work where I get up and I feel like I function as a part of society. And then at some point I like put on my superhero costume and go out and have my night job where I get to go and play songs that I wrote with my friends and have a lot of fun with it. It's very intentional. I do feel like from a sanity, mental health point of view, I like to not kind of commingle art with commerce too much. So I don't want my being as an artist and as a creator to be what pays my mortgage. Even if it does, I think I have to kid myself into being like, I want to have a full real job. anyway, so I was rolling out communion for many years, and then something that's quite unique about the US market is that a lot of the concert venues are actually tied up with exclusively with promoters, whether that's Live
Yep.
Nation or AEG. So the only people that can put on a show in that building happens to be a promoter now. You have to have a lot of money to have that much power to be able to lock, and you have to basically get into the real estate business. So I was like studying that, and then I was looking at their model, and it seemed to be almost incomprehensible how they did it. And you know, these huge companies, and they were using ticketing platforms and sponsorship income to kind of prop up what was a very expensive endeavor to kind of have these exclusive rights over various different cities. And I was talking about that with my brother, who at the time was the North American finance director for Soho House Group, and he was in New York. I was in New York. Somewhat coincidentally, but also I think we just wanted to be in the same place. And I was sort of sharing these woes, and it happened to be a family gathering where our dad was with us over Christmas, sort of talking about the state of what's tricky out there in the venue and promoter landscape. My dad for a long time was a managing consultant, accountant, specializing in corporate turnaround. And he kind of really wanted to problem solve with us. So we started looking at different ways in which we could maybe have a venue. And something that I think these other promoters weren't focusing on so much was like the radial impact of venues. Meaning like places that people kind of gather, the community comes out in droves to go and have like a once in a lifetime experience, like be with an artist on stage or go to a club night where they're like meeting someone for the first time. And there's a whole like secondary derived world around that, which is all the food and beverage business. And that was the world that my brother Greg had come from, having been at Maxwell's in London and then Soho House for a number of years. So we were like, why don't we just bring our worlds together? And then it was like, well, where are we going to try to do this? And Greg was in the process of moving back to London to go and open up the Ned. And I knew London like the back of my hand. I still do. London's like my like origin story. And have like played every venue there, have promoted thousands of shows. So we just started looking at what was available in London, and we started talking to brokers and looking at various leases. And this quite interesting little spot opened up in London Bridge, where a local developer was trying to create kind of something along these lines, where they were looking for like an anchor of a music venue, but they had also taken on a bunch more arches, and they were going to try and build like a kind of a whole destination of different food and like restaurant offerings, and then big volume bars. And we were like, this is it, like let's go and pitch ourselves into this. So we secured that site in 2015, and we opened up O'Meara in 2016. I came back to London and was living in London for a couple of years. As we got all of that off the ground, it was amazingly successful from the jump. I mean, the 320 capacity music venue with a footprint that was about 9,000 square feet, so we could host club nights. 320 is like the viewable room, and then there's space in that club for 750 people on a club night. And it was like where Skepta and Ellie Goulding were hosting their Brit Awards after party in February of 2017. So like after like 6 months of being open, we were already kind of in all of the press for being the place where all the cool parties are happening. And then we took on this amazing grime night called No Mercy. And then we met the folks from Little Gay Brother, and we ran that night really successfully for a few years before that emerged into what is now Feel It, evolved into what is now Feel It. So, you know, this is kind of like the quick origin story, but it was all like the theory worked, and it kind of proved out. And then we said, well, that was fun. Team was stabilizing. We had established a management team on site, and we're like, well, let's do some more. So we kind of started to look at more sites to grow this, and And now we're in a place where there's a few venues in London. We've actually split now when my brother's running the UK business. He stayed in London to run that, and it's called Lowline Entertainment Group. And then I'm on the expansion back in America from New York, looking at how do you build these venues in the States. And we've got currently we have 2 venues open in America, but we're opening another one in LA next year. And then, yeah, you know, they're like, every time you identify a project, it takes years to come online. So it doesn't sound that impressive just to have a handful of these things, but it's a huge amount of work to bring them online.
I can only imagine it is. With Communion, I mean, obviously that's something which is still like, you know, going at the moment and has been kind of like massively successful and has identified some great kind of like artists. What kind of trends are you seeing in terms of the artists coming through? And like, are there any tips or hints that you would give to individuals? Because I mean, a lot of people watching this are going to be from hospitality backgrounds, and a lot of people fall into hospitality from the arts. So, what advice would you give to somebody who is kind of like looking to break through or stand out?
There's more music than ever. Some of it by real people, some of it by machines, flooding into what is like hard to kind of make sense of. I think someone said there's like 120,000 songs a day get uploaded into the digital world. So
Jesus.
no one's listening to that. So, you know, in some ways that's kind of really depressing. In other ways, I think you kind of you start to consider uniqueness on a new level, meaning kind of how do you be individual in what you're offering? What's your story? What's your sounds? And that doesn't mean you have to go into kind of avant-garde abstract music. You can be a kind of a person holding a guitar and speaking your truth. But what's interesting is that it becomes all about your truth and your story. And that's like, I think for some artists quite intimidating, for others a bit of an opportunity to kind of shine, is to get into their kind of trying to go inwards as much as possible. Trends are almost gone because everything's got so democratized with the way that everyone listens to music now. I don't think we see these kind of, there isn't this like wielding zeitgeist thing where it's like everyone suddenly runs in one direction and we have like the grunge era or the disco era. Now it's kind of like everything's kind of coexisting and there's all these like pockets and sub trends and whatever that is. And so I just think that it's kind of a fool's game to try and like analyze that. And if you want to be making music as a full-time career or that's just who you are and what you want to do, I don't think it's like trying to analyze anything. I think you just need to like turn off all the noise, sit down with a pen and paper and just try and be honest. And what's interesting about the difference now versus 20 years ago when we started Communion is that there was still quite a lot of those big trends that were kind of dominating, which was why we launched the platform in the first place, was because we were like, there's so much great music out there that no one's even paying attention to. Whereas now I do feel like there's less gatekeepers. So I don't think people need to be quite as intimidated about whether or not they fit into a certain mold or look right or sound right. You know, some of the biggest artists in the world, from Stapleton to Chapel Roan to Shabuzi to like, I don't know whether 20 years ago those artists would have become global superstars. So it's interesting that to me because it's that's a positive thing because it means you don't have to homogenize everything.
Yeah.
So someone who's like a believer in like unique expression, I'm glad that everything doesn't sound the same.
Yeah.
So yeah, my advice is always like, just do you in the most real way you possibly can. Either people will dig it or they won't, and if they don't, it's fine as well. Like don't kind of put your stock of validation based on what people think of you. But if you try and like do something that isn't you to be successful, and then that actually does take off, then you're going to spend your whole life being someone else that you don't want to be, and then that will probably end up moving along as a trend anyway. So yeah.
Wow. When you're looking at kind of like, future venues for the venue group and that's kind of side of things, do you tend to look at it about where there are creative hubs currently in terms of like moving to LA? Is that because there's a creative hub in LA? I know when we met kind of like a couple of weeks ago, we were talking a little bit about Africa and the Middle East and all of that kind of stuff, which I think was maybe more from a consumer perspective. But in terms of the markets that you think are really interesting moving forward, how do you think about where you would like to be or where you would like to get involved in next?
I think it is this will be my, outside of the band, this will be my life's work now. I don't like there's an insatiable amount of arguments in every which way to answer your question. Like within the big cities where they're kind of already these cultural epicenters where artists gather because there's opportunities to collaborate with other artists, there's good access to studios and inspiration, and like that's all there. What's interesting is that a lot of the venues in these big cities have kind of fallen into disrepair or been overlooked. So, we ended up launching 3 venues. Well, we launched 2 and then we saved a venue in London from going under. And that was like, the reason why that was all successful was because there was actually more of a lane in even London than you would think. And London's, number 1 or 2 most culturally impactful cities in the world. So I don't know. I mean, like, there's an argument for going inside out, and then I'm also really interested about how people are leaving these places. I think, I've been in New York now for 14, 15 years, and there's a negative migration. People are leaving New York year over year, and partly because I think New York needs to turn up more for this stuff culturally, but also because it's just so expensive, and people are moving out to places like Nashville and Austin famously, but also Raleigh in North Carolina or Huntsville, Alabama, where we've built a venue. And what's interesting about doing something like in a city like Huntsville is that you're sort of big fish, small pond culturally. We put in a venue and it's like, it's helped really define the fabric of that place. And that's kind of enticing in a different way. I think going and introducing cultural infrastructure of whatever scale it needs to be brought in, whether that's a small club or a large amphitheatre or whatever, to meet these kind of growing populations. Because obviously overall, people are just moving around, and sometimes where they move might not have a good venue or hotel or restaurant or bar. And so, people are trying to play catch up, but these things take years to come to fruition, like I'm talking about. We don't go in and just, it wasn't like a failed restaurant that was in a restaurant retail unit that we come in and just fit out again and then start like selling pizza. We're talking about a lot of the time ground up construction of a site that has never been used for anything before, and then creating like a placemaking thing there. So and then that's just US, UK. And I do think that there's a lot, you take that idea even bigger and you think about where's the cultural infrastructure for emerging artists and for artists globally to tour into continents like Asia and Africa. Your mind just goes and goes and goes. Knowing it takes like 3 to 5 years to launch one of these things, maybe I get to do it another like 10, 20 times, but like, it's like and in that way, it's incredibly rewarding, because there's kind of, we're not finding any limits to the need of what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned about kind of like people showing up in New York and that kind of side of things. And do you think consumer behavior has changed pretty dramatically? Is this a COVID thing? Is the way that people experience music and experience kind of like, clubs and all of that kind of stuff? Is that different? We've seen this massive shift kind of like, recently towards no alcohol, I mean, that kind of side of things as well. The demographics kind of like are all changing. What trends are you seeing across the business in the US and the UK currently?
Well, I'm
Big
remembering that
question.
we're in a few different verticals. So we're in like, I could talk about that from a hospitality point of view, but also venues. But just from a venue stance, more people went to a gig in the last 12 months than ever in history, or paid for a ticket at least.
Yeah.
That's a good sign. I think during COVID, everyone was like, I just want to be somewhere with other human beings, having an experience that doesn't feel like a rerun of another show that's being pumped out onto my TV or my phone. It was like kind of a bit of a moment for live experiences to kind of prove how much they mean to everyone. And there was a lot of effort put into like bringing the feeling of the sentiment of that into people's living rooms. Performances, live streaming, all this sort of stuff. And it just, I don't think it scratched the itch for anyone. And that's just like a live show. You think that should be somewhat possible to kind of package up and give to someone. It's not. It just doesn't hit the same way as like standing in a room with 2,000 people and like putting your arm around a friend and like crying as you scream the lyrics back to the band. Like there's a thing about that. And then there's the whole club scene. And that's even harder to translate. If you're going out for a club night, you're doing that from a social point of view or to like really get out of your head. That's like, you're not doing that by yourself on your phone watching some TikTok. That's just not happening. So, trend wise, we've seen this like burst of people saying we do care about experiences together. There's so much available because at the same time, lots of performers have like come out of the woodwork and there's lots of options that people often buy tickets late, which makes the whole like cycle, because normally depending on the size of the venue, from a month to 6 months out, like how many people are actually going to come to that event.
Okay.
Now that's like a week to 6 weeks. So that's a bit nail biting. And also, I think people are a bit less committal for some reason. I think it's to do with like the attention spans, or maybe there's other things messing around with their value, like their cost base. So if say they bought like £15 for a ticket for a show, but to go to that show, they're paying more for maybe some childcare or equivalent, cat care or whatever, not cat care, but whatever. Like, and then they've got to get a cab or take training, and they've got to buy a meal. Like that whole night out, it's like a choice of, it's like an opportunity cost thing there, which it's been really crazy to watch the last year or two. It's like people would rather just not turn up, even if they bought a ticket like 6 weeks before to a show. The further out, the more likely this is to happen. But people will buy tickets for an event and then they'll just say, the associated cost of that £15 is like another £100.
Yeah.
And because of various things going on in the world and cost of living, I'm just going to stay in. Like, it's a shame. And do I even know how to, or do I have the wherewithal of like selling that ticket out? And like, that just sounds like a headache. So people often, there's just a lot of like dead tickets, which is like not great for the event industry, because, we can't
You need
sell
the atmosphere.
if it's sold out, it's sold out. So a lot of the time at a sold out show now, we're seeing kind of 20 to 30% of people just not turn up.
Wow.
So they already said at one point, I'm definitely going to be there. And then when it comes down to it, they're changing their minds. And pre-COVID, that used to be about 5%. So that's a big change in behavior. And then when people are there, if they are like, you know what, I'm going to turn up, but because everything else has got a bit more expensive, I'm actually just going to get one less drink. Or I'm being a bit more health aware, I'm going to get one less drink. Or whatever the reason is, that's also like spend around shows when the people who do turn up is down. And anyway, yeah. So it's tricky because, and then like the cost of everything's up. So that like the kind of the fine for anyone who's followed the world that I exist in with this stuff at all, it's well documented in the press that this is a very kind of tough industry to exist in. Like you do not get into venues to make money, and it wasn't my core mission to do so. Hoping that they could be viable and investors could get behind it and support it and but it was never like this is going to be the next microchip AI company.
Yeah.
But in that, there's like these little things do add up and make a big difference if 20% of people don't turn up and they buy one less drink. And it also makes a difference to the artist's career on stage because they go out and maybe 20% less people saw them. So then those, even if it's a great show, there's less people to recommend to their friends the next time that artist plays a show to be like, hey, we really got to go and see so and so next time. So their growth being affected by that.
So, I mean, I guess that leads into the next point about kind of like, creating this great experience kind of like in venue, and all of that side of things also comes down to like, great people, basically kind of like, from that perspective. Like what trends have you seen kind of like within your workforce, and how have you been kind of like, managing to retain and kind of motivate, I guess, kind of like, your top talent?
I think people are really proud of being in like a mission-driven organization like ours. So people love being around. A lot of the time, artists will turn up at our venues, pay the compliment of like, this is the best venue at this size or in this city I've ever played in. And I think that there's a real sense of purpose that comes from that, like, and pride, and it doesn't feel like it's for the sake of it. Like this is about trying to like build cultural infrastructure in cities, and I'm sure you're very familiar with the term ikigai, and that kind of balancing out what we do with what we love and our kind of, and how does it contribute to the world.
Yeah,
I think getting into this particular space, especially if you're someone that maybe can contribute either administratively or on the front of house, like serving a drink. You can serve a drink anywhere. You could serve a drink to someone going to watch a game of football. You could serve a drink to someone on a train on their way home. You could serve it, like there's like so many different environments to do ostensibly the same thing. The difference is for us is that we're kind of providing that service to people in an environment that they are like laughing at a Kevin Hart comedy show because it is like, it lit up their week, or they're like crying because that lyric that singer just sung has just like spoken so deeply to the core of who they are. And so you feel like you're kind of contributing towards something that's happening. So we've done well, I think, to attract a group of people who care about that stuff. A lot, I think probably 70% of the people who work with me are in some shape or form either musicians or massive music fans. We have like internal channels where we talk about new releases, and I just went to this gig last night, and that's like a part of the culture of the thing, is that people are proud of being passionate. So, and sometimes I'll find out, it's not like a kind of a criteria when we hire people, it's just, it comes out the woodwork. It's like, oh yeah, I used to play flute in a band or whatever the thing is. And you're like, of course you did. Like, that's why you ended up with us. So, yeah, I think there's some of that, and it doesn't take much for people to feel like the place that they spend their time, their, living days working, actually has some greater purpose to it. And we're not a non-profit, even though we tend not to make a profit, but we're not set up as a non-profit.
Understood. And I mean, it brings me into the next question, which is about kind of like everybody's talking about kind of like, what benefits and like, all of that kind of stuff that they get to working within businesses. But I imagine if kind of like a lot of the people who gravitate towards your organization have a music interest, I guess kind of like the benefit is being able to work within that environment, or do you do anything specific to kind of nurture that?
Well, we try to do both, and like I want people to earn a good salary, to get good like benefits that maybe help their um, whether it's their physical, mental health, or we're pretty generous with time off, and I don't think I've ever like counted anyone's time, or there's none of that culture. So that's like I want to make sure that we're good, regardless of good as like taking care of our team, regardless of the fact that there's an added benefit that like Neil Young just walked through the door. Like that's like a cool thing. I wouldn't want to trade um, the cool factor or like the kind of the stuff that I was talking about before about that like deep sense of purpose. I wouldn't want to say, and that's why we're not going to give you health insurance. It's like it kind of the two things need to live alongside each other in my mind.
Absolutely. And just one quick question: as somebody who operates a business in the States in hospitality, I'm going to ask a question about trade unions because, like, there's a lot of kind of like, like, especially if you're in the UK, you hear it's almost like a bit of a barrier to companies going over to the States now that kind of like people hear about these trade unions and they're almost kind of like quite worried about them. Kind of like, what's been your experience of them and how have you navigated that?
We haven't had that much experience with that. I mean, there's been a little bit of organizing in general. I'm pro like the principle of it, so I'm
Hmm.
kind of it does not intimidate me. We tend to just go with whatever the advice is for whichever city that we're operating in. I think if people um, told us that it was going to cost X amount more, and we had to hire this many people to do certain jobs, that would just find its way into our model rather than being like a kind of a go, no go thing. I do, I'm also not going to kind of like soapbox about trying to like get everyone to be unionized. I think we'll just operate within whatever the norms are, where there's, and it varies, right, between like security teams and cleaning teams and bars teams. So we're like it kind of, we work a lot with people who are contractors as well as employees. So sometimes on the contractor side, it's absolutely structured that way, but I don't really, it might just be my naivety, but it doesn't, I don't see the problem with that. I'm kind of like, fair enough if those people want to stand as a united front and request certain things. Like it's a choice of whether or not to bring on those. So if you need it, you need it. So I guess it's a very washy and probably like for anyone who might be watching this, very infuriating response to such a complicated subject. But I've been operating and doing stuff in the States for 15 years now, and it doesn't like I don't wake up in the
It's not
night.
a factor.
I don't think about unions overnight now.
Okay, excellent. Good to know. So obviously, last couple of years, like, we've had COVID, we've had cost of living crisis, we've had dodgy budgets, we've had election campaigns, which might not have gone as everyone might have wanted, not getting political, but I mean, like, it's been pretty interesting, kind of like, all around. What do you think's coming up in 2025? What have you got your eye on? What do you think the big challenges are going to be?
I'm trying to be positive and um,
The last question's positive, Ben. That's the negative question, then we finish on the positive.
well, um, as it stands right now, I think we've all kind of picked up a few bruises and scrapes in the last few years, and it's all relative, right? And I think I've thinking that I kind of got into doing all this stuff in like 2008. I've like been through enough of a journey. Even though I'm still in my 30s, I feel like a lot of what I talk about today I sound like I'm an old man, but I'm like I I I do not anticipate anything more than everything that you just laid out being a factor. And if it is, then we'll just deal with it. If we can start 25 on the basis of how tricky 2024 was, then we've adapted to trying to figure out how to operate in that paradigm. And, you know, it's been hard, but we've now adapted. So we're now like leaner, tougher, harder, stronger, whatever the Daft Punk lyrics are. But yeah, that's kind of where we are.
We should have played that game where you kind of see how many song lyrics you can get in to the interview, Ben. I mean, you've just given me that idea. That would have been amazing. Penultimate question, but just kind of like looking back over the last kind of like 18 years, all the different things that you've done, like what would you change if there was like one or two things? What brick walls would you not have ran into? Any kind of like advice out there for kind of like aspiring or current business leaders that you would give?
I was like a little bit idealistic. Maybe like I wouldn't have changed that because it helped me in some trickier times to be kind of an optimist. But I think having someone, either find it within yourself or having someone very close to you who can be super like realistic and pragmatic. And I've definitely got over my skis a few times on ideas and projects, whether that's just in terms of the time it's going to take to pull it off or the cost of it, or I've like often seen something in people that maybe they don't even see in themselves, and then it turns out it's not actually there. And I kind of like, I think if I was to, I'd maybe take a slightly more cynical view from the jump and then be positively surprised that didn't play out, rather than be like, you know, my mum always told me like anything is possible. So I've like taken that approach to life, and then it turns out that some things really aren't possible. So like it's kind of tricked me up, that mindset. I think it's probably what made me a dreamer and like an entrepreneur and creator in all the ways that I am. But yeah, I think most importantly, you know, being very cautious around being able to afford the things that you like lock in. So if you're bringing on a team, making sure you've got enough runway to get to the goals, and that can't be like the goals that you hope to achieve. And then if it doesn't work out, then you've got to rewind. I think if you can kind of build more slowly on success, and don't worry about kind of everyone saying, wow, isn't it amazing that you were like overnight. Like there's no separate prize for being an overnight versus a long-term success story. And now I'm definitely taking the approach of like, I'm going to be doing stuff in music and around music for the rest of my life. I just want to spend every day doing it right. So patience and level-headedness, I think, are really key virtues.
Excellent. We're doing this interview series, and somebody mentioned kind of like in a call earlier on this week that success is as permanent as failure is. And I just thought that was kind of like I thought that was a really nice one as well as an entrepreneur.
I wish I had some sound bites like that. I haven't got any good sound bites. Yeah.
I'm sure you do.
I haven't read enough of those books.
I'm sure you do. You need to get those like those page a day kind of like books, you know what I mean? That's it. And so thinking about 2025, so you've got LA coming up, which sounds really exciting. What else is on the horizon for the venue group in 2025?
We're working on projects in Detroit currently, which is going to be very interesting. I love that city. It's a fascinating story, Detroit, LA, like you said. And we're working on something else in Huntsville, which we're hoping to be launching that should be launching next year. And then just a lot of like design and construction on projects that will probably come out in like 26 and 27. And I'm going to have a busy year, as ever, with my night job as well. And I'm also a dad, so kind of juggling the different things is all fun of it. But I think we're going to be doing a lot of foundation work, and then with TVG, and then doing hopefully a really successful launch of a new 750 cap venue in LA by the end of the year.
Excellent. I mean, does not sound quiet and does not sound boring, Ben. So thank you very much for joining us today. I really enjoyed the chat, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Cool. I see you. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks, man.